hand, and we will deploy a roving mic. If you could kindly introduce yourself and then pose your question to the relevant panelists. That is the protocol that we will observe. Let's get straight into the discussion. So it really is building on what we have been speaking about throughout the summit, and that is unlocking sustainable financing for Africa's transformative development. And Esther, I think it's important that we start with you. I'd like to get a sense, Razia mentioned the Big Four investment and how that is changing Kenya's socio-economic development. And I think if we're looking for tangible solutions, which we've all put very clearly on the agenda today, it's a good place to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Brahman. First, let me start by thanking Standard Chartered for inviting us to participate in this very important meeting to discuss such an important topic, which is where we all need to be focusing on. Let me also give the apologies of my cabinet secretary, who was not able to join us this morning. He would have very much wanted to be in this panel. However, there was a cabinet meeting this morning, so he could not join us. I think it's important to state that Kenya's development agenda is laid out in the Vision 2030. In which we obviously set an objective for ourselves, an ambition for ourselves to ensure that our people, our citizens, have growth, that they live in a clean and secure environment, that we become an upper middle class country by 2030. And based on that vision, we've been having 5-year plans called medium-term plans to work towards achieving the vision. When the second term of the president started, he looked at how best can we achieve this and set up the 4 big agenda, which is really speaking to the needs of the people, and how can we create that environment where the people there's economic growth, we are addressing the real needs of the people. So we looked to housing, affordable housing for our people, to agriculture, food sustainability and nutrition. We looked to manufacturing to create jobs and to ensure that we are doing this kind of things that we've been talking about here, which is that we are in fact adding value to our own raw materials, having manufacturing opportunities that give products that we can consume, that we can export, and all that, and universal health, because we all need to be healthy. A healthy society is a society that can grow. So these obviously are great challenges. There is huge financial need to be able to make this 4 big agenda a reality. And I think that is why this meeting this morning is an important one, because in the public space we don't have the financial resources that we need to be able to deliver on this agenda, and we need to work very closely with the private sector. Every need is an investment opportunity. Every need is an opportunity for innovation, and every need, and to be able to make all those work, we need the financing, obviously, to make it work. And therefore, the question is, how do we make it attractive for private sector to partner with us in terms of bringing that innovation, bringing the financing? How can we make the financial sector respond to our needs and help us in some of the challenges that we see?
You're picking up on exactly the questions that Sunil put on the table, and that is what can governments do, which you're covering, what the private sector can do, and then Sunil, you pulled in what banks can do in terms of transforming Africa. Dr. Katui, I want to come back to the free trade agreement. It certainly is, as you say, academic at this point, and now it requires political will to implement. But this could be, and you were also excited about it up on stage, this is the single biggest change across the African continent that could drive that sustainable growth. I want to get your sense now in terms of the trajectory I know what to take back to our finance minister in terms of his framework, but what can we do to fast track that political will? Because this has got to be the low-hanging fruit for Africa.
Well, not terribly low-hanging, but potentially. I think in the face of, with the headwinds of xenophobia, you see the challenges to free movement of persons around the continent. That's one of the challenges we do. But I think a number of things are very important. First of all, talking to a predominantly banking community, I want to say this. One of the biggest challenges in Africa right now is to facilitate low-cost movement of small amounts of money from African diaspora in Africa. You know, if you just look at statistics, African diaspora last year remitted $86 billion to Africa, to African governments, some of it from African countries. That is more than twice portfolio investment into Africa. That is more than ODA into Africa. So by far the largest source of FDA in Africa is Africans in the diaspora. Now, those in Africa are the ones who pay the highest cost of remitting their monies home. The banking industry has surrendered a historical leadership responsibility to fintech companies. Today, when we go to meetings to discuss how can we ease movement of African money, we talk to MasterCard, we talk to PayPal, we talk to Safaricom, and we talk to MTN. The banks have to start playing a role in this. How can you be facilitators? How can you turn an antagonistic relationship into synergies with advances in technology to reduce the cost of African movement of money? That's going to be a major source of financing Africa's transformation. Secondly, apart from just unlocking the potential within the continent, we have been auditioning before the wrong audience. We go to the Western capitals to look for investments when the money is in Eastern Asia. Thailand alone last year was a net exporter of FDI to the tune of $32 billion, which is more than half of all the FDI that went to Africa. Last week I was talking to the Chamber of Commerce of Thailand, last Monday in Bangkok, and they're saying we want to drive our next phase by being financiers of South-South cooperation. The same message I got on the margins of the IMF World Bank meeting in Bali a year ago. Indonesia is ready to go to Africa, but where are the suitors? They are busy looking at Europe and America. Nothing is happening where you are auditioning. Start auditioning in a new market. Number 3, illicit flows out of Africa. For the past 10 years, steadily, illicit financial flows out of Africa are at least as much as ODA into Africa, about $50 billion a year. If we can stem this, if we can find the political will, the technical cooperation, and the energy to stem illicit flows out of Africa, the challenge of filling the gap for finance governance development becomes a very small thing. Now, lastly, to your question about the FTA, yes, there are political players around this continent who are believers. There have to be business people who are ready to work through that door to make it work. I negotiated customs union in East Africa. It could only get live when the business community took the driver's seat. And I think we have reached the point when the business community, from financial institutions to investors to logistics companies, started taking the driving seat for Africa's continental food development.
So I think it's important to understand how seriously African governments are taking this challenge, and not only governments, but also the private sector across Africa, to sustainable transformation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just from the last part that you ended, African governments taking leadership. Actually, Africa is a leader when it comes to climate change. 90% of the ratification of the Paris Climate Change Agreement have been done in this African continent more than any other continent in the world. What is that telling us? That African countries have seen the inherent opportunity within these agreements that they put. But the biggest problem, and I think Dr. Kitui also alluded to this, has been implementation. The ratification always happens at a very faster rate, but when it comes to the implementation where the rubber meets the road, that is where the limping starts. And so what needs to happen at the moment is to turn those policies into reality. We need everyone on board. We need the private sector on board. We need governments on board, but we also need individual citizens. And I think there has always been this missing link where we look at development as a pure government-driven agenda. And I want to make this point, which is the time for government to regulate, to proliferate policy and implement policy and monitor policy is long gone. The role of government is to create an enabling environment so that the private sector and individual citizen can come in. But when you look at that, it then means that if we are talking about 60% of the continent's population that is being youthful, are these youth having the rightful skills to be able to tap opportunities? And the other aspect is, which was mentioned by Sanil and also mentioned by Dr. Kitui, the continent of Africa has 65% of uncultivated riverland, but you have 257 million people going to bed hungry. The continent of Africa has 365 days of sunshine. You have 620 million citizens energy impoverished. The continent of Africa is at the bottom of the value chain, as Dr. Kitui pointed out. Why? Because they export raw materials, that's exporting employment and importing unemployment. If you take just the food sector, and let me narrow down there because I want to bring in the financial aspect, and especially since we're talking to the banking community here, if you take the food sector, Africa is importing food worth $35 billion each and every year. That's on the lower side. That they are importing unemployment and exporting employment. When you look at the uncultivated riverland in the entire globe, in the African continent, so that means that if you are to invest in adding value to what is produced, you will be indirectly reversing the 35 billion that is being used to import unemployment into the continent. And more importantly, the continent is losing $48 billion as a result of post-harvest losses. If you take, for example, there is a constituency in Kirinyaga County here called the Moe constituency. And that is where rice is being produced mostly. But Kenya is importing rice worth 200 million each and every year. But what you notice on the ground there is that each farmer that produces rice, when there are downpours, they lose 50 kilograms of rice because they use the sun to dry. So that then means if you are to invest in decentralizing just simple solar dryers for these farmers to be able to dry their rice, they will not only be producing quality rice, but at the same time, they will be reversing the post-harvest losses that they are facing. And because it is quality rice, they can speculate when to sell it and when to sell it to the millers. And that way, you will be solving an environmental aspect. But in the course of decentralizing, you'll be spurring an opportunity for solar dryers to be manufactured, especially by the youth. And you'll be creating value chains whereby financial investments could get into this solar dryers aspect. But lastly, there are also aspects of social systems that have been ignored sometimes. If you look, the African continent is actually built within this philosophy in rural areas of chamas, as they call it in Kenya. In West Africa, they call it njangis, and cooperatives. Leveraging on these cooperatives is not just a fabric that have existed for quite a very long time, especially these chamas, whereby banks can tap into them, because what the research is telling us is that there is a financial gap of about 300 billion in the continent, especially in these local communities, where when you introduce blockchain, especially in the banking sector, whereby you can capture some of these actors that don't have bank accounts, but you can capture the information, you will be filling that gap of 300 billion, whereby most of these farmers are smallholder farmers that will then start not just to produce the food, but can now be able to afford solar dryer to add value. Lastly, the quality of people. We're talking about investment. Where do we have the people with the skills to be able to leverage on the investment that are coming from a financial dimension to drive transformation? So skills retooling, especially for the youth, so that they can become the actors to drive transformation and leverage on opportunities to be able to move forward. Dr. Kitui mentioned about remittances, the diaspora remittances into the continent. By next year, they are projected to be 51 billion. Yes, above 51 billion. This is an opportunity for the banks to start looking at those who are receiving these remittances that are sent by their families or friends abroad, to start creating bank products, but with targeted investment into areas of agriculture and clean energy to add value.